Yeah, so I just have a few questions about like a couple movement things and then a couple things about like speed and strength.
Okay, cool.
So my first question is um this one partially pertains to me, but
No, that's
like
perfect.
struggling to get to depth in a squat, like specifically a body weight squat, because it's like when I add load, it'll usually clean up, but body weight is I struggle. So
Okay.
yeah,
Now, I mean, what are you with heels elevated or just without?
I mean heels elevated makes it better, but like if I don't do heels elevated, it's not. It's probably like 70 degrees.
Okay.
So yeah.
Okay. So, well, one of the things I would break the squat down into, like certain joint by joint in a way with that. It's not exactly that, but I wouldn't try to do the whole pattern all at once too often. So basically, heels elevated will take the ankle, if you will, issue out of the mix, and you can worry about that later, if you
Yeah.
will. So I would always separate out like what's going on with the pelvis, hips, and even knees separate from the ankles when you're trying to work on that, and put the two together, but don't often try to work on the two together, or otherwise you're going to have a lot of compensations, and then that's going to lead to anything that you're gaining. It's going to be fake anyway. All
Mm.
right. So I would also understand the idea of building mobility has to be found during the inhalation phase more than the exhalation phase. So it's going to be understanding like how to breathe in for the purpose of mobility more than to the purpose of strength in a squat. So when you're talking about getting yourself below parallel, you're going to have to get there and be strong there. Like I'd imagine when you get to parallel, you can hang out there. Like you don't feel like you're going to collapse.
No, not at all. Yeah,
Right. So you
it's like
feel
I
like
can't go farther.
you're strong there. So that would be, you can consider that concentrically oriented. But you can also just think about it as like you need space there, right? So you're compressed at that point and you can't move past that. So you want to really make sure that you in the position that's an easier position for you to feel it and to gain it. You want to make sure you can feel yourself move pressure down into your pelvis to create some expansion there, right?
Mm.
So, and you can think of it as you're actually trying to create external rotation, but I think that could be confusing when we think about like the way that we normally think about the planes of motion in the hip. But you're just trying. It almost makes more sense if you just think about like you're a flat tire in your pelvis, and you need to fill up that tire, right? So if you're just lying on your back and or even just sitting on a chair, like you have to be able to say, where when you inhale, your inhalation is expanding your belly in a 360 degrees, but also you're feeling like you can expand down lower into your groins, into your pelvic floor, and you have pretty good control of that. And then you can also visualize like where the sacrum is, and is that sacrum being, so you understand the difference between nutation and counter nutation. So like the base of the sacrum from the anterior side of it needs to take some pressure, and that would counter nutate it. So you're going to need to be able to counter nutate better to get to the bottom of a squat. So you have to be able to feel that, I think, in a position that's not too challenging and you're not under a lot of load. So even just hanging out in a partial squat, like you're going to probably be too concentrically oriented. Your muscles are going to be working too hard to feel like you can create any type of extra expansion. So I would do a lot of work, just like you can do it as a box squat, but I would just do it in like easy positions for you where you can feel gravity's assisting the down, right? So you want to feel like you're in an upright position so that you can feel like an assistance in pressure moving down, right? And that can even just be like meditative breathing sometimes, right? Inhale, can you feel pressure moving down? Can you feel expansion low in the belly, low in the base of the sacrum, down into the pelvic floor, just everything opening there? And then can you do that in progressively positions that are progressively closer to the body weight squat. So it's really helpful to do that as progressive box squatting, where you're just like starting wherever you feel comfortable, just maybe like a normal chair. All right. But think about your feet as if how you'd want to have them with whatever squat you were trying to attain. Is it a
Mm.
foot forward squat? Is it a hips open squat? You know what I mean? Like whatever position that you're trying to improve mobility on, you put your feet in that position and you try to breathe there and feel expansion down there first. Eventually the expansion will try to, you want to get that up too, but first you have to be able to feel like it's down into that area, open up the pelvis. All right. So make that the easiest position to feel that, and do that often, and then tie it into the squat. So sitting is, the lower you get into a squat, right? It is a version of sitting. So if you sit on your own anatomy, in the bottom of the squat, you are sitting with that chair, and that's ultimately what you're trying to do. So you just need to bring basically that sitting point up by using a chair, some type of box or something like that, and then you got to get the breathing right. And that's a tough thing to do. Like you need to have an understanding of what you're feeling, but that would be something that I would work on, and then you're using gravity to assist that. By you're going to probably feel that easier in an upright position actually than you are lying on your back. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
Now,
Yeah.
if you want to expand somewhere else, like say you want to expand like the space between the shoulder blades, then that position wouldn't be the easiest, right? Like flipping yourself on your back, then it would be a little bit easier. But I think if you're trying to expand the pelvis, which is where I would start, then I would get into that. And you might find that if you hold onto a pole, you can sink your hips down quite a bit lower to the bottom of the squat, because you don't have to worry about, again, that concentric orientation of just stabilizing without some type of assistance. And you might not need the actual seat. And then you have this sort of like dissension, this hang there, that you might actually feel a little bit easier to feel some expansion, belly into thighs on the front end, the sacrum moving kind of posterior as you get some air there, the pelvic floor moving down, and just spend as much time as you need to. I look at mobility stuff tied into endurance stuff very much, because you have to be able to spend some time there and you got to be able to breathe there. And if you can do both of those things, then it gets easier to spend more time there. So, but if you're compressed, it's harder to spend time there. So you got to give yourself the option to make it easier so you can spend time there, but it also helps you breathe better.
Right.
Okay.
And then for so like choosing a depth for the box, you're looking to get to the point where you can get there comfortably in a squat, but like you don't want to get that point where you're just getting lumbar flexion at the bottom, right? Because that's not necessarily counter nutation of the sacrum.
I mean, and that's why to me, like the proprioceptive feeling of the breath really matters, because I can't look at someone necessarily and see all the time, like, are they exactly in counter nutation, or is it like some type of compensation up the chain? Like you get a better eye for that over time, but like if you can really feel expansion in that area, then even if the rest of your skeleton kind of looks in a direction that you wouldn't want to get it, you're relatively moving yourself in the right place. And that breath, like the breath is like the internal pressures, the internal forces trying to create that space there. And then the body position and the relationship to gravity would be more of the external forces, right? So just having gravity kind of push things south helps you get a little bit more expansion down there. But you also have to make sure that it's not so hard that your muscles are fighting back, because they're going to fight back to make you not fall over. And that fight is always going to be up.
Mm-hmm.
Does that make sense? Right? Because otherwise you collapse down. So you have to make it easy enough that your body's not fearful of that fall, because it will always go into this guarding mechanism, which is fighting against your mobility.
Right. That makes sense. Okay.
So cool. I think from Bill Hartman's stuff, like the certain ranges of motion of the squat matter. Like so the closer to the bottom, you're in more of an ability. It's easier to expand if you can get there. So if you can assist yourself down that low, it might actually be easier to feel expansion there, and it is. But also above the 90 point, like where if you were doing just a bodyweight squat and you were doing an isometric and you just said hold, it would be hardest you'd feel the most work in your muscles at about that 90-degree angle, like where you're parallel, thighs parallel. So a little bit above that, doing some breath work there, right? Still
Hmm.
in a position where gravity's pushing you down, but trying to feel like, because you want this to expand here. So just being in a position where it's easier to feel here. My knees are bent as if I'm working towards a squat, but I'm much higher than that where it's too challenging. I think the key really is that don't make it too challenging, and then can you feel the expansion where you want to? You'll find that even in that 90-degree place, like if you sit or you're holding on with enough assistance, that you might be able to still expand there. That's fine. That's still helping you work toward the bottom because you're being expansive. That's all that matters, right? You're trying to give that area space. Okay? So if you're thinking about, there is an exhale that can happen and should happen when you're working on mobility. So the idea would be to keep the idea of the pelvis expanding that you create during the inhale. And then when you exhale, you give yourself a little bit of space by moving the concentric contraction to your middle more, belly button in, maybe pelvic floor up. The next inhale expands you more. So the inhale and exhale should be like superimposed on each other. You don't want to exhale and then lose everything you gained during the inhale. So the way I like to cue it is like reach the limbs. So even when you're exhaling and you're making your middle go upward and your belly button go inward, that you still want to have some sense of reaching the limbs long. And that can keep the idea of like sinking maybe a little bit deeper. But the inhale is really, it usually gets blocked when you are immobile. And it's harder to, you're going to want to breathe up here because everything is so compressed down lower. So you'll compensate there. So just being able to do that where it's not really working out, just consistently getting better at feeling yourself being able to move pressure down on an inhale, and then getting that closer to the squat would be the practice. Now I don't know that that's quick. It's just it's the practice. But if you neglect the breath and you just put yourself in the position, you may never get where you want to get.
Right.
Okay.
Okay. And then I guess my last question on this topic would be, what about when you have, I mean, I have this problem, but like I think other people have this problem too, is like your knees just want to go out the whole time. Like is it beneficial to add something between the knees to counteract that, or is that reinforcing that concentric, high threshold pattern?
It depends on how hard you're making the exercise again. So you don't have to squeeze too hard when you have something between your knees. And if you're doing something like a pull assisted squat, right? Like you're climbing down to the bottom of the squat with assistance, and you just have the block between your knees as like a spacer as opposed to an active like
Right.
squeezer, then that actually might be perfectly fine. It really still depends on, can you feel the expansion when you want to feel it. So
Mm.
as you get lower, say you're using the pull and you can get lower than you would be able to get if you weren't using the pull, you would think, all right, what gets compressed when you go down there? So if you're able to squat with the knees closer together, your belly and your thighs are going to start to approximate as you get a little bit lower, or there's going to be some massive like compensation where your back is really flexing, but you're also moving away from your thighs, which can happen. So you want to sort of, as you're descending, you want to seek that compression. You want to seek that belly to thigh, but then you want to use your expansion on the inhale to give space to that. So, because if you don't have it, then you get pinching, right? You get impingement or you get some type of compression there. But you want to bring yourself into the compression first with support, making it as easy as possible, so that you can actually get a little bit more feedback for feeling the inhale expand you away from that.
Mm.
Because otherwise, if you don't go into that initial compression, then there's usually a compensation away from like the direction that you're trying to go. If you were to take your hands off that pole, right, you
Right.
just fall over. You always want to think about it like give yourself assistance, but then also understand the direction in which you're trying to go if you didn't have that assistance, because your body's always going to want to compensate around that. And when you hit the wall, like your wall understanding that direction, then you spend some time there and you breathe and you try to make the breath be able to expand you. Okay.
Right.
So
And then the
well,
key is finding that place where it's not too hard
exactly.
to the point where you're just tensed up or
And
breathing.
yeah, and also that you can spend time there. I think like give yourself a rule of thumb that if you can't spend 90 seconds there, it's too hard
Mm,
for most of what you do with mobility.
right.
And there are other ways to train mobility more actively, certainly. But I think if you are really compressed and you aren't doing any of that work where you're able to spend 90 seconds to 2 minutes, you're often making things too hard, and you're not understanding the separation from the eccentric and the concentric. You know that you need the expansion, the compression.
Mhm. Okay. Cool. Awesome. Thank you.
Yeah.
Um, and then my next question, flipping the script a little bit. Um, I've been thinking about quarantine and not being able to access weights as extensively, and sort of thinking about um, increasing amount of speed training, like absolute speed training versus and distinguishing that against maybe speed endurance to a point. Um, and I'm curious how you would change or how you would program that differently. So absolute speed versus, speed endurance.
Yeah. Well, I mean, so just in general, like if you look at absolute speed, you have to be looking at very short duration type of actions, right? And it doesn't really matter the like how much rest you take in between. It's not really about like kind of getting a workout. It's about maximizing a rep, if you will. Like so, if you're sprinting, the distance that you sprint is the rep. We'll say. So you're maximizing that, but you're not trying to necessarily get some stimulus of repeated repetitions of that accumulate to improve like the fitness. So I look at like speed endurance would be like the whole workout is the accumulation of sets. Where when
Mm,
you're looking at absolute speed, that doesn't really matter. It's just like every time you time yourself in your speed, how fast are you going? So
right.
you would one if you're going to separate those out, you have to really look at the rest breaks differently. Um, and so one of the things that I'll look at, and I don't know that I necessarily like think of it in my head as speed endurance versus like absolute speed, but I will do a lot of work where if you have a velocity based trainer, like a push, that's a really good thing to be able to use. So you're familiar with push at all? I mean, there's other velocity based trainers, but
Yeah, I'm thinking of like gym aware.
Gym
That's
Aware, yeah, that's a higher end version.
yeah,
But I'm not as familiar with that. I know that works really well, like on barbells,
yeah.
and on a like external equipment. I don't know how well it works as like if you're putting it on your own body for body weight stuff, but it
Hmm.
might. I'm sure it does. It's a higher end version. So for like home, you don't have to pay as much as like a trainer would for their whole business. You can look into Push, um, which you could put it on as like a little wristband. You could also put it on as like a waistband, and you're actually measuring with every set you do your velocity. So you're making the the goal not to just get a certain amount of reps. You're trying to maintain a velocity for a certain amount of reps, and when your that velocity cuts back, well, now that's your sweet spot for reps, and
Hmm.
that'll change as you fatigue, but it'll also kind of dictate how many how much rest do you need, right? Like if you want to do a certain amount of sets just to kind of get the volume in of the training, and your velocity is going down with only a 1 minute break, then you need to give yourself more. So it gives you a little bit more information of how to dictate the difference there. And I think you can do that with most movements. Like with your own body weight, right? So you can do absolute speed training if you want for a push up, just relative to that movement, and that has some value because it's still working the fast twitch muscles from a standpoint like globally looking at that. Now if you're trying to get better at sprinting, then you kind of have to sprint, and sprinting is something we can do in this quarantine. So that's like to me one of the best ways to do just absolute speed work if that's the goal. If you're looking at it more from like what's the best way I can be fast, well I think it is sprinting. But you can really take any body weight movement and just take it through this sort of transitional continuum of like, okay, one, do you have control of that movement? So that's the other thing you always have to look at. I think for someone like you with your athletic background, you do. But if it's somebody that's like someone in general, like a general population client that is just getting into fitness, I'm really not touching absolute speed with them because I probably can't find a movement that they control well enough to cycle through the movement and keep control, right? Because speed is really going eccentric to concentric really quickly, like accelerating and decelerating really quickly in a continuous fashion. In a way, where like power would be doing that maybe for one rep, right? Just like being able to cycle through the eccentric to concentric for one rep, and you don't care. You can take a break before your next one. But speed, I would look at it as like I'm trying to get a certain distance in less time, so I have to cycle through multiple reps quicker and be efficient with that. There's a lot more complexity to that movement pattern. But you can do that with any movement as long as you have control of that movement slower first, and
Hmm.
then you've trained it that way enough, or you're confident in your ability to kind of cycle through things faster.
Okay.
If you don't have the the velocity based metric, then what you can do is just take a certain amount of time. Like time really matters, right? So think of your energy systems like, let's just say 15 seconds is the most, and this is a little bit arbitrary, but let's just say like beyond 15 seconds you're going to probably start to slow down. So like I like to keep my speed sets to about 15 seconds. How many reps can you do in 15 seconds, right? And see if that's changing because you're getting so fatigued of
Hmm.
whatever the movement would be. Or it could be, what's the distance that you're running in 15 seconds, right? And if you have a way of measuring that. So I think a lot of times with speed, like the hard thing is how do you measure it? Because things are moving so fast that it's a little bit harder to measure than load. Or when you get to strength with body weight, it's sort of like the challenge of the thing that you're asking yourself to do one time.
Right. Okay.
That makes sense.
That
I
makes sense.
mean,
Yeah.
did I touch on everything with the question there, or was there?
No, I think you did. Yeah, I think you did. And then I guess my like a follow up. Um, so so I get like, is do you have a cutoff for if you're training absolute speed? Like, what is that cutoff? I guess if you take your best rep of the day,
Hmm.
where do you cut it off when it's like, okay, I've gone, like, I'm not fast enough anymore? Is that like 95% of your best rep, or not like 90% to the point where you're not necessarily training absolute speed anymore because you're just going too slow?
I mean, I don't have a solid answer for that. I think, especially when you use some of these pieces of technology, you understand that there's going to be a little bit of error.
Mhm.
Um, so I'll give you an example specifically. Like I'll use the velocity based training for kettlebell swings a lot, and I will use that as sort of my cutoff a lot of times. But I have in my head too that I'm not going to go more than say 15 seconds, or would
Mhm.
be about 10 reps. So if I in that period though, if I see like 3 reps in a row that are substantially slower, like I'll give myself a 3 rep. I'll give the device 3 reps basically to make sure that it wasn't really inaccurate in that way. If I'm doing stuff with reps, like how many reps do I get in a specific set, I might give myself like an extra set to say like, or maybe I could give it a little bit more this next time. Maybe I just paced it wrong. I'm not going to cut it off with one time where I'm below, unless I've already done a lot of work. And if I've done a lot of sets already, um, then I might also have to consider that I didn't make it hard enough for myself. So I have to like load myself or something like that.
Right. Okay. Cool. Um, and sort of my last question, I guess, is going more down the speed route a little bit, but more general. I guess you could start with sprinting, but apply it to anything. Just thinking about, I guess people can train speed, obviously, possibly more than absolute strength in this time. And I'm thinking about, can there be a benefit to strength in the long term from spending that time at more the speed sort of zone of the force velocity curve. Can that be a benefit for certain individuals? I guess because, if you start with sprinting, and you think about whatever the reported measure of, like, on each step, you can have upwards of 5 times your body weight in a max effort sprint, or just thinking about some sort of weight room movement that you're doing for speed because your load is, you're using a loaded backpack or something.
Right.
Can that is there a potential for people to benefit from that in the long run when they do get back to more strength work because they've spent more time where maybe they have a deficit?
Yeah, I mean, there's certainly potential, and I think you just have to look at who you are, like what your goals are. So if you're just like general fitness and you're not like you don't have a specific like sports goal, like it's good to let go of some of the things that you were doing a lot of before,
Yeah.
and just say like let me work on some of the stuff that I wasn't doing a lot of before. But you have to go through that process gradually. But you're just going to build your overall like fitness. Now you might lose a little at the top end because specificity ultimately builds like the thing that you're trying to get better, but that's not necessarily health anyway. So it depends on who we're having this conversation with. Like my clientele typically is general population, but even some of the athletes that I work with that are high school level and trying to be high end, like I'm giving them stuff that I just want to see them progress in different mediums. Like the thing that they're trying to get better at in their sport isn't squatting. It isn't like a specific movement that they need to be in the gym for. You know what I mean? So
Mhm.
it's more the global idea, and you can absolutely get your absolute strength better with body weight stuff. You just have to look at it differently, right? So if you don't own a one arm push up, then and you start to own a one arm push up, well, now your absolute strength with your own body weight is improved. I would think of it like if you can do something for one rep that you couldn't do before, I think of that as absolute strength, right? So like you can say the same thing with load. Like if I could not lift 3 times my body weight and now I can, my absolute strength has improved. If I couldn't do a one arm push up and now I can, now my absolute strength is improved. And that's something that can be trained at home without body weight. Check out the
Mhm.
Naked Warrior by Pavel. I mean, that's all in there about like if you just have body weight, like how do you build your strength? It's the one-legged squat and the one arm push up. But there's other ways to do it. Just gymnastics geared towards men, I would say, but I'm sure there's a bit just because of the events are very different for men. They're more body holds and all of that work is absolutely building absolute strength in my opinion because you're looking to do one rep of something that you didn't think you can do.
Mhm.
You know what I mean? And it's just the way that you're looking at changing the challenge isn't just adding like an external load. It's changing leverage, changing pillars of support. But all of that does create more resistance, right? That you just have to be able to control. So you also get the value, I think, of bodyweight training is when you're looking at it from a gymnastic standpoint, you're usually gaining more control of more range of motion. You're getting stronger through like a greater range of motion typically to be able to do these kind of more challenging things one time or for a hold for a certain amount of seconds.
Mhm. Right.
So I think to go from another way to look at this then would be so say we take like one specific movement and I had this experience and it was pretty eye opening to me like with velocity based training how that can actually carry over to improved absolute strength. I look at it as it can kind of blast through your sticking points a little bit. So with the idea of like triphasic training, which I know you're familiar with, where when you're doing something under a lot of load, there is there's a threat, right? So when you're doing the negative portion of say like a back squat with a lot of load, it gets more and more scary basically to go down with that weight because you might not come up or something bad might happen. So you may slow yourself down in a manner that is detrimental to getting back up. So figuring out how to control your velocity with submaximal loads and making the thing that you're going after the velocity, not the load, but you have your metrics like that, what you're trying to hit from a velocity standpoint, but you're still progressively overloading within that programming. You get much more confident moving a heavy bar faster. You get much more confident in moving whatever you're trying to move faster, which can help you get up some heavier things, right? Because think about it as like if I take more time under tension to bring a load down, I might have gassed myself out if it's truly a max to get that up with a press, with a squat, anything along those lines. So certainly, like training the idea of velocity gradually from a progressive overload standpoint can actually help you get some lifts, I think. And that was definitely my experience doing some of that work with back squatting for myself.
Yeah. No, I agree. I feel the same way about when I was doing that a little bit.
Yeah. I just don't know how it carries over if it's like sprinting to squatting, like
Yeah,
you're sprinting
there's
to back squatting because it's not as specific.
yeah,
It's better than doing nothing, and I think it's better than say doing body weight squats with no resistance. Like add
right.
like that, just the challenge isn't there. It might actually make you more, it might be detrimental to your absolute strength to squat, where something like sprinting might be better for that. But I think you're going to lose stuff because you're not doing the thing that you need to do
Right.
to get better. Like if you lose that specificity, a lot of times you're going to lose a little bit. But if you're just looking at like being healthy and gaining overall fitness, sometimes it's good to just say like, let me let go of that. And
Yeah.
there's plenty you can do with just your own body weight. And a lot of times that's good for people. So the physical therapist in me would say like, you know what, this is an opportunity for a lot of people to get a little bit more versatility in their movement repertoire. It really
Mhm.
is,
Yeah.
because like if you have all the other options, you tend to use them, and you might go into that realm more because you're already familiar there, right? And when you have to do something that you're unfamiliar with, I think that can often lead to a lot of health gains if you do it in a smart way. If you're gradual with it and you understand like, okay, this is I'm trying to build an attribute. I'm not trying to like get a hard workout. Like if you're doing something new, you shouldn't really have a hard workout the first session. You should try to figure it out, understand like what's the first step to make this like moderately challenging, and know like later on it's going to be something that's more challenging, but like at the same time your body will be ready for that increased challenge.
Mhm. It's like thinking of it in some way more as a skill than as a, or just thinking of it as a skill in a sense.
Absolutely. Yeah, and I think like if you really think about what you want out of like your body from a health perspective, oftentimes you just want to be able to do stuff better, right? Like so when you get older, you want to just find that like you can move like you did as a kid, right? Which just really means that stuff isn't hard. You don't want to have to make things hard. And
Mhm.
sometimes training is that, but I think it's unnecessarily that if the intention is like, oh, I made myself sweat with the same things I'm doing all the time, and I'm not exploring like other stuff that is currently hard for me. Well, now it's like it's not actually helping you because you're just doing the same stuff. You're not getting better at anything that you're deteriorating with. So you always have to make sure like if something is hard, it's hard because you're really challenging something that would be useful to make life easier later on. All right.
Mhm.
And there's always a relativity there. Like if you're sitting on the couch, like any movement is better than not. But if you're someone who's active on a regular basis, and this like we're not a society, I don't think. And if you look at I think some statistics, like we actually exercise quite a bit. So we look at like the obesity epidemic and think like we're a lazy population. I don't believe that to be true. I just think that we're getting we're kind of taking our exercise and we're just trying to like be rapid through it and just do the things that aren't complex like fast and hard to try to give ourselves some type of sweat stimulus. And if instead of looking at it as a skill, like we're trying to get better at things that would normally deteriorate with time. And when you do that, you actually don't want to work as hard on a regular basis because learning doesn't happen well when you're really taxing yourself all the time, right? So if you are going to tax yourself, it should be with something that you're already pretty darn good at. And if you're always doing the same movements, then you don't have time to learn new things, and deterioration happens there.
Mhm. Yep. Cool. That's really helpful to think about. I mean, I've been spending a little more time trying to work on some of my sticking points, and yeah, but I did get some actual weights recently, so I've started to neglect that a little bit as I start just squatting heavy again. But whatever.
Yeah,
Uh,
and I mean, get your split squat perfect in this time.
yeah,
Like your rear foot elevated, your forefoot elevated. Like I think the forefoot elevated split squat was a revelation to me when I did the intensive because I mean I heard of it. I never really had my body go through it. I was like, oh, like yeah, this makes a lot of sense. Like that, I think will actually, and you have to be gradual with it because if you're not there with just your regular split squat,
yeah,
not elevating either side, then you might not be able to do the forefoot. But like work on that pattern with no resistance, or just like if you have a dumbbell, like a little bit of goblet resistance, you'll get a
yeah.
lot out of that by manipulating tempo, right? So if you just slow that negative down, like if you want to feel something, you'll feel it. Believe.
That crushes me more than
Yeah. Now,
anything I do, honestly.
do you want to crush yourself? If you're trying to improve your mobility, what I would work on, like something like try to get yourself to a good forefoot elevated
Yeah,
split squat, because that starts to work on some of the mobility. But you have to make that kind of eccentrically oriented, so you have to be able to feel the expansion as you're descending into that. And I think that there is like a continuum to, as we're talking about like spending some time in a position, that that makes you feel that expansion while things aren't too complex, because you're just there breathing.
yeah,
As you start to tie it into, repetitions, where you'll feel like this sort of acceptance of the down when you go faster, that leads to the up. So if you just think about like the inhale is receiving you on the way down, and the pressure is building low, so that like a toothpaste, if I squish the toothpaste, everything goes back up. Well, if
yeah,
the toothpaste is empty, there's nothing to squeeze, nothing goes back up, right? So but you get this sense of almost a bounciness to the repetition as you get better at that expansion on the way down, and then the like a switch into being concentric on the way up. That I don't think you can cue that unless you have the ability to do that slower first, or even static
yeah,
first. But once you start to get that static, you start to feel that with movements that go a little bit faster. And it also, I think, it helps with maybe not absolute speed, but it helps with the idea of changing directions quicker. Like the
mhm,
kind of load unload idea is, you will be going through basically inhalation exhalation, but if you start to try to add that breathing into dynamic movement and you've never done it before, it gets too complex. When
yeah,
you feel your body in a position and you know, well, this is better for me to be in this position when I'm expanded and inhaled, then you'll do it every time because you've practiced it slow, and then it becomes more dynamic and more automatic.
yeah, yeah. No, it's like I try to distinguish between the two, where it's like if I use it in a warm up or something,
Hmm.
then it's focusing on that. But then I think sort of changing the intent during an actual workout, if it's like depending on the goal, like if I'm going for hypertrophy or something, then it's changing the intent to output, but try not to fully lose some of the principles you take from, the slower, more eccentrically oriented practice in a sense. Yeah.
And not to plug my book, but just the four markers of control that I've kind of tried to use over the last 14, 15 years of being a therapist, that make the most sense to me. And you can certainly go deeper than that, but is when you're doing any movement, you want to make sure that you're not in pain, and if you are in pain, you want to explore that, and you might need some help with that. And then you have to make sure you have breath control with whatever you're doing, would be the second one. You have to have postural control, and then you have to have impact control. But the breath control, I think, is the thing that gets neglected a lot of times. And when you're talking about intent, no matter what your intent, the breath intent will change, but you want to make sure that it is still an intent, right? So just
Right.
because something gets hard doesn't mean you forget about how you're breathing and you just sort of do the thing, like you just complete the task.
Yeah.
Uh, Now, because you won't be as successful in the long run, but especially if you're training to get better at something, if you don't have an intent for your breathing, then you really don't have like this idea of if something's too hard or not. So if you're going
Mm.
from like a static hold, well then you have a specific breath intent there, and it might be like a 4-7-8 breath, 4 second inhale, 7 second exhale, 8 second, or 7 second hold, 8 second exhale. That might be too hard. It might be something else. You know what I mean? But you have to have that intent. And you have to see, can I hit that intent? When you
Mhm.
start moving more dynamically, well, it might just be like if you're sprinting, it might be that you're timing an exhale to, a foot strike or something like that. And it could be multiple things, but you have to be aware of that is important, and then that matters.
Mm.
It might be like exhale and pelvic floor ascension, right? Like, which I think makes a lot of sense sometimes for a cue when things are more dynamic, so that you're not as into the ground. You're being a little bit lighter on your feet. But there could be many things, but you just have to have, I think, an intent with that breath that you are trying to match. Otherwise, you're being mindless in a way with your movement, and you're just trying to make things hard. And then you would say the same thing about like postural control. You want to have an intent. You don't want to look at it like there's a good form and there's a bad form. You just want to look like, what's my intent? What direction do I want my limbs to move? And if they're compensating in some other direction, I would have to say I've lost postural control, and I have to have some way of being aware of that loss.
Mm.
And then impact control would be just, if I'm landing, for instance, like, am I landing with the kind of softness that I want? Sometimes you want to land a little harder, sometimes you don't. Oftentimes, like if you're trying to keep your joints healthier, you want to have some idea of how do I land lighter. But if you're doing something where it's like maybe one repetition for power and I want some stability, maybe I want to land solidly, and there's a timing to that. So again, the intent matters depending on the action, but all of those four things really should be going through your head when
Mhm.
they're applicable, which they are for most people.
Yep. Awesome.
Cool.
Yeah, that's really helpful. Cool. Awesome.
Maybe
That's
maybe
those were the
what's that?
well,
Maybe we do this again next week.
I'm in. Yeah.
All right, cool.
I
Monday.
what are you gonna say?
I
Monday
just said
what time?
Mondays usually work well, so we can do that.
Okay. That's cool with me.
All right. Did you have
Sweet.
any others?
No, that's what I had for today.
Perfect.
I just got a basketball in the mail yesterday, so I'm gonna go shoot a little bit.
That's been very valuable for me. Did you play basketball in the past?
I played in middle school, stopped in high school, but I figured I was like, we have a net. It's something for me to do.
So one thing to explore is, and I played basketball for like the first 18 years of my life, pretty much like I lived it, and then I gave it up, and I still have like the motor memory basically of how to do things, but like without competition, it becomes this completely different experience. Like I'm not shooting around because I'm trying to get better to go play against. I'm almost doing it now to just think of it from a movement perspective and explore. Like the ball going in the hoop is like a test retest for some of the different things I'm doing internally within my body. So look at it from
Yeah.
that way. Like, are you inhaling at the top of your shot? When are you exhaling? Like, think about some of those things and use the accuracy as some feedback. I've been finding it very relaxing in a way, because I don't have that like competition in my head
Yeah.
anymore. And it's just like, okay, like the accuracy to it is very well, if you are being accurate, but just how you have to be accurate, I think, is very parasympathetic. When I'm just trying to like kind of be loose enough to feel the movement without any type of guarding or anything along those lines. So as I start feeling like I'm more accurate, I tend to feel more relaxed. So
Mm.
it's been a nice little just getaway sometimes, and then it gets me outside.
Yeah. Yeah.
Cool.
Well, 10 follow throw shooting earlier, so that was a good start for me.
Nice.
Yeah. All right. Awesome.
Well, I'll be in touch, and maybe we'll get together next Monday too.
Sounds good to me.
Have a good one,
All
man.
right.